Just want to give you guys a short presentation on how to basically create a low-res sort of base mesh from a high-res sculpt, and then how to generate some key maps for use in other 3D software outside of ZBrush. So I'm going to go to Geometry, and in this case I've actually got multiple subtools, so I'd have to go sort of tool by tool for this to really work, but let me focus specifically on the main portion of this model here, which is the head. And this head has pretty high subdivisions, I guess. It'll go up to about 2.5 million polys, and it has a fairly high degree of detail. So what I'm going to do is basically duplicate that subtool, because I will be creating a new low-res version of this. Now I do have a low-res version of this model at 9,592 active points or polys. And I could reduce this further. So one of the ways you can do this is to go to Geometry and do a Z-remesh. In this case, I've already Z-remeshed this from a Dynamesh. And you can keep Z-remeshing your models. There's actually nothing wrong with that. The only thing that's going to prevent you from hitting or going below your target poly count, which for this assignment currently it's 2,000 polys. So I'd have to set my target count to 2,000. Actually, I probably want to go a little bit lower, since I know I've got other subtools to factor in here. So I'll try a 1.5, and this is in thousands, so 1.5 would equal 1,500. And what adaptive density does is that it'll increase the poly count, the target poly count. So it'll kind of actually ignore the poly count and add edges where edges are needed or required. So I'm actually going to turn off adapt so I can really get aggressive and try to hit that count. So I can hit Z-remesh, and you can see I'm actually kind of halfway there. So I could do one of a couple of things. I could try, let me just smooth this a little bit out as well. I could try to manually reduce this mesh in max, or I could just keep going with the Z-remesh. So I'm going to try one more time, Z-remesh, and the poly count is getting a bit lower. I'm going to try to lower the target count here a little bit. And right now I'm at 1,810 polys, which is not too bad. So a few things I could do as well. I should probably delete the back polygon. So if this were a prop that, in this case it's a door knocker that goes onto the surface of a door, I would basically, this side would never be seen, so I could definitely delete those polys. For that, I would export to 3ds Max or Maya and simply delete those polys. I could also delete them here in ZBrush, so I'm going to do that simply by going into my Select Rectangle tool. So that's Control-Shift will access that Select Rectangle tool. And I'm going to just kind of grab the polys that I know I can sort of see on the back side, and then I'm going to slowly and carefully deselect these polys. Now I might also switch to a flat color material so I can kind of more clearly see what I want to subtract. So I'm holding Control, Shift, and Alt to now do sort of a subtractive selection. All right. Now it's not the cleanest, but I could try to, let me click Control Shift, click on that to invert the selection, and I can start by basically maybe deleting those polys. Let's see here. So I'll go to Geometry. Under Geometry, we want to go to Modify Topology, and I'm going to say Delete Hidden. So it's going to delete the hidden mesh. Okay, so now my poly count is at 1,668, which is pretty decent. I could probably remove a couple more loops. I'm going to, again, be careful here and try to just get rid of some of those last remaining little bits. So let me see. Okay, so we can go through, we can hold Control Shift Alt and start to select through. You just have to be careful not to grab the front side stuff. We can go about this another way, so I can go back to isolating those back polys again one more time. And if I Control Shift click on these again, I'll invert my selection. And here, let me just undo this. I'm going to turn off perspective, by the way. So I want a nice kind of flat view. You know, it's an orthographic view of this mesh, so I can really just hone in and get those last little remaining back polys. Again, if I Control Shift click on these, invert my selection, I should be able to again go back to modify topology, delete hidden, click on that. And again, one more time, I can just sort of select. Let me switch this, by the way. So while holding Control Shift, I've got the select rectangle brush active. I'm going to switch the stroke type to a lasso. So now I can sort of quickly go in and just really roughly grab all this stuff that sort of seems important. And then, again, just really get in to those back polys that I want to remove. So I might just keep this stuff here. There. So again, I'll Control Shift tap on that, flip it around. It looks like a much cleaner selection. And I'll go back to delete hidden one more time. Now, if you really want to get very accurate, I think very clean edges along this thing, you can see there's some edges that are kind of off of each other. You could export this thing to 3D Max or Maya to clean those edges up. You know, maybe get rid of that loop, let's say. Right, sort of tidy this thing up a little bit more. But that's, you know, if we're going for a high degree of, let's say, cleanliness and accuracy, which ultimately you should aim for in most of your projects, but sometimes just doing a good enough job is more than enough. So, yeah, for me, though, I'm a perfectionist. I'm going to just tidy this thing up. There. And if you want to really see the inside and outside portion of these polys, you can go into display properties, and go to double-sided, and you'll be able to see inside and outside of that mesh. One little quirk though, if you hit undo, for some reason, undo will actually turn off that display setting again. I'm not sure why that sort of still happens in ZBrush, but it will happen from time to time. So just try to be aware of that. You may just have to go back to that panel to turn on double-sided again. Okay, so let me just isolate this area one more time and just cleaning up the stuff that I know I want to delete. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to Control-Shift click, Control-Shift, Alt-click on that, and that's going to invert the selection. And again, very repetitive, right? Let's go to Geometry, Delete Hidden. So I've got a fairly clean version of this mesh. And so what I'd like to do now is I'm going to basically project this stuff, get all my detail, project it from the other version of the model onto this version. Now the reason why I need to project is because if I'm going to do extractions within ZBrush, I need this sculpting detail on the high res to be part of this low res mesh. So what I'm going to do with this low res mesh is basically divide it until its poly count roughly matches that of the high res mesh. So in this case I've hit 1.5 million polys. The other model here was 2.4. In this case I think I could probably get away with 1.5, so I'm going to go back down to my low res. I'm going to make sure the visibility of my other subtools is actually turned off. So I'm going to carefully click these, turn them off. So the only two things that are visible are my original sculpt and my new sculpt. The reason that's important is that when you project sculpting detail from one version of the model to a newer version of the model, it does it based on visibility, so you have to turn off the other subtools. So next I'll go to project. So I'm at my lowest subdivision, right? Lowest subdivision. And I'm going to project all. So it'll look at the tool below, which is the more polished high-res sculpt. And it's going to project the detail. And you're going to see, right? Let me undo and redo. So you see the low-res mesh has been sort of shrink-wrapped to the high-res. And now what I like to do, I find this prevents errors, but I'm going to do project all at each subdivision level. So I'm just stepping up and hitting project all. Now there may be some areas where there's a little bit of mistakes happening, so you can try to soften those out, or sculpt those out, I should say. You know, maybe you could smooth and do another project all, which could help fix things. You know, sometimes the other issue is the scale of the object, and there's this little thing called the projection distance. So what it does is it looks at the distance between the two mesh. So if I get out of solo mode for a second, you're going to see how close these things are, but they may not be sitting exactly on top of each other. So what I can try to do is increase the scan distance just a touch and see if I get a better result. So let me get back into solo mode, and you see actually I get a much more accurate result after projecting all. So I'll step up again one more time, do project all, and we'll again basically be grabbing a snapshot of the sculpting data from our highest res sculpt. So it's grabbing, all right, this is our low res here, new low res without the back, and it's actually grabbing all the information from this high res sculpt. So let me go back again. I'm going sort of through the different subdivisions and projecting all, and that allows me to grab all the sort of subtle details in the sculpt with minimal errors. Usually I never even have to touch the distance slider, but if I do, it's such a simple minor fix. And worst case scenario, if I absolutely have to, those little glitchy areas, I just smooth out and do a touch-up sculpt really quickly. Now, as you go up in subdivisions as well, as you get into the millions of polys, this process will get slower and slower, so just be aware of that. Okay, so I just paused the video to prevent you from hearing me breathe deeply into the microphone for 10 minutes, really creepily. So this is now my new base mesh, my new, I guess, mesh design for low-res export. So I'm going to go down to the low subdivision so you see that there. You can keep your high-res sculpt if you want. Just make sure you start to organize your scene a bit. So I would rename this, let's say, head underscore high res, or maybe just put a space, high res, just keep it kind of short form name, and I'll call this head low res. By the way, the rename button, just if you didn't catch it, I'll zoom in, is right there, right in the middle of this sort of subtool palette. Rename. Now, sort of the second big step in this process. So once you've got a sort of satisfactory low-res mesh, is to create an unwrap for this thing. So we can go to Z plugin, UV master. This thing works fairly well, although it's not, again, it's not the most accurate for low-res mesh. There's a couple ways you can go about working with it. The main way is to go into what's called control painting. So what happens is when you paint on this low-res mesh, if I go to enable control painting, actually you're going to get a warning, by the way. Let me just go back here. Enable control painting. It'll say this function requires a model with no subdivisions. ZBrush has a number of quirks, and one of them is that some functions just don't work on models with subdivisions. So we have to kind of cheat and work around this. So if we go to the geometry panel, and you'll see this section called freeze subdivisions. You're going to freeze this. So what this basically does is it stores the actual model with all the subdivisions that we have. It sort of temporarily hides it away and almost gives us an exact duplicate without subdivisions at the lowest res. So so we can now work with our unwrapping tool. Just don't forget to unfreeze your mesh. If you get into trouble with that, there are some workarounds, but it's much easier if you remember to unfreeze. So I'm going to go in, enable control painting, and I can go to protect. So if I want to protect areas from getting split apart, I might want to protect the front of the nose, maybe the lip area here. Excuse me, maybe the cheeks. Let me just turn off Shift F4. It's going to look a little bit goofy. It's going to look like clown paint or clown makeup, but what I can then do is say attract. So what it does is it recognizes these colors perform a certain function within the unwrapper. So if I want to, let's say, split off the mouth, then I would attract a seam right around the lips, like so. Actually, maybe go a little bit further in there, like that. Yeah, that's pretty good. Like I said, Bozo the Clown has become part of our scene. And then I might want to split off these little kind of claw feet things that I've got. So I'd put paint along those seams. And I'm doing this in symmetry. Again, this is a nice and convenient, fairly symmetrical piece. Split off the goatee, maybe the ears. There. So what it'll do is it'll actually follow those vertices or those edges that have this color and try to split those off. So go back to protect. I just want to touch up the lips because I actually want to protect the outer edge of the lips and make sure the inner edge gets that splitting effect in the UVs. Yeah, and I'll paint a couple more. So I'll go to attract and just paint along here. There we go. And maybe attract along this edge as well, just to split this thing up a little better. Try that one more time. All right. So now if I go into Z plugin, I'm going to hit unwrap. We won't necessarily see anything yet, so what I usually like to do is go back to the Z plugin menu. I'm going to copy the UVs because we actually, remember, we have to unfreeze this mesh. When we unfreeze it, we actually lose the UVs, and so you have to come back to this menu and paste them onto your original model with subdivisions, but you paste them on the low res. So I'm going to make sure I copy these, and then I'm going to go to flatten. Now it should have split this thing up. Let me unflatten this and try. Oops, let me undo a little bit. Yes, unflatten. I seem to have lost my control painting, so I've given you the basic gist of it, but you have seen that it's buggy, so I will suggest that we basically unwrap this in 3D Max. So I'm going to just go Z this, and it's actually my first setup on a new install, so I'm going to basically install the plugins where I need them to be. 3D Max, Maya, and we'll skip the rest here. So I'm going to export to 3D Max in this case. Okay, so my mesh is now in 3D Max. So what I'm going to do is, again, do a very, very quick unwrap. For me, the easiest way to go about this is to basically use the peel tool. So I'm going to go to edge mode, and I'm going to turn off the map seams. So there may be already some sort of pre-built UVs in here somewhere. So I'm going to just turn off map seams, which will deactivate any kind of green edges, which then allows me to focus on using the pelt tools. So if you guys aren't familiar, you can basically go to edit seams. So if you go into the mesh, you can click, and this will add these little blue lines, or if you hold Alt, it will subtract the blue lines. There's other methods which are much quicker, so you can basically go point to point. So if I now grab, let's say from this point here, click over here, and just click on points that are sort of nearby, I can kind of quickly get very decent loops. Now I'm going to undo that and just get a cleaner loop here. Sorry, there we go. So I'll go point to point. And yeah, let's get in behind here. There we go. So I'm going to right click to kind of stop that point-to-point tool from remaining active, and then I'll restart another sort of loop selection here. And then right click to deactivate, go back point to point, and then we'll quickly go around. And it should, for the most part, follow your topology. If topology is fairly good, it will go around and flow around properly. Another way to use this tool is to grab an edge here and then go to loop edges. So it'll grab a loop around. And we can see that there. I'm not crazy about that loop, so I'm going to grab the interior one and hit loop again. And that one's actually pretty decent. Because this curvature is so extreme, there's sort of what would be called, I guess, an undercut. There's this deep recess. I do want to split this off, so I'm going to use another button that I haven't shown you guys yet, which is convert edge selection to seams. So I'll convert that to seams. And that's it. I'll basically use point to point for the rest of this. A couple of notes, though. I think some of you may be noticing that, you know, the topology doesn't kind of flow around the ears very cleanly. So if I try to drag a line across here, it might get a little bit messy. So, you know, this sort of stuff I might fix in 3D Max and do kind of a custom topology. Again, it all depends on how much time you have to dedicate to your project, both, you know, whether you're working as a student or in the industry, right? So sometimes you have to just kind of make do with the mesh you have and speed along to the next project. So in this case, I'm going to just go with it as is and try to get a decent selection around here. Okay, so I'm going to just finish up in this area. Oops. Yeah, let's find that edge where the sort of head meets the hat or the crown, whatever that thing is. And then I'll grab this sort of upper edge like so. So I'm just trying to kind of create or find the sort of true borders of this thing. So let's grab this. You can see how quickly this point-to-point tool makes finding these edges and basically creating a kind of pre-made slice. Now you may need extra cuts, so your first pass may not be your final, but you know, chances are it'll be good enough for baking out maps. So the next step is to go to poly selection, grab a poly somewhere on the mesh, and then go to expand poly selection to seams. And then we go to the Pelt Map Tool. So I'm going to go Pelt. So it's going to open up this floating window. And I'll simply hit Start Pelt, Stop Pelt, Start Relax, Stop Relax, and Commit. And I'll basically repeat this process over and over. So I'm going to go expand to border, pelt map, start pelt, stop pelt, start relax, stop relax, and commit. So what that basically does is it's going to basically grab these little pieces, it's going to stretch them out, and then the relaxing will try to bring back or try to match the proportional distance of these vertices, the UV vertices. It'll try to match that distance on the actual mesh, so you get minimal distortion when these things are flattened out in the UVs. So this thing works fairly well. I'm going to commit that. You know, the face probably needs to be broken up a little bit more, but I'm going to, again, just kind of rush through this just for the sake of the demo. So I'll start pelt, and it will look a little funny. And I'm going to start to relax, and you see it'll kind of remove some of that distortion. And I'll do the interior of the mouth next. So expand to border, pelt, start relax, and again we should get a decent interior of the mouth here. Go to the claw foot, there we go, start pelt, start relax, and commit. So let's do that. You know, if these edges here, right, they kind of represent the toes of this thing. So in this area, I may have needed to add some of those blue edges, those pelt seams, to help flatten that out a little better. Same thing with, let's say, the goatee area. I might have needed a couple of splits here, maybe running from here down to here, just to get a cleaner unwrap. But I think if you can get away with it, great. If not, then you might have to do some additional kind of cutting and tweaking of those UVs. So let's do the ears next. Start pelts. Start relax. That's decent. Grab the other ear, and I think we're almost done. And we'll commit that. So now we've got all these big kind of UV clusters packed in. I'm going to hit Control A on my keyboard to select everything. And then I'm just going to simply go down to pack normalized. And what that'll do is sort of pack everything in roughly so that it sort of fits into the UV workspace. I can also tell this thing to rotate and do another pack. And maybe I can drop the padding down a little bit. So that's basically the gap or the distance between the pieces. And I can try a new pack. There we go. Now, if I ever plan to actually paint these in Photoshop or something, you do want these pieces to line up, so you may have to kind of rotate stuff around and do a little bit of manual packing, and you should move stuff right off of the outer edge of the UV space. So in this case, I'm just going to touch up the spacing and everything by hand, and I might actually try to give the bulk of the head a little bit more room. So you know, there may be more detail in that area that I want to put some texture in. So yeah, let's just try something like that. Oops. So yeah, a little bit of hand packing can actually go quite a long ways in giving you a much better result for spacing and whatnot. So I'm going to go to the freeform scale tool and drag this out, and if I hold Control, I'll get more of a uniform scale. So I just want to enlarge that a little bit more if I can. And I'll just continue to rearrange just a bit so I get a little bit more of an even pack. So that should be good for the most part. Oops, just move this piece down. There we go. Make sure there's no overlap. That's very key as well. So I'm going to send this thing back, hitting Go Z, edit in ZBrush. And it should, here, let me actually unfreeze this mesh. I kind of forgot about it here. So I'm going to unfreeze this thing. And it's going to bring back our low res. You'll see projection in process, so it will take a minute or two for this thing to reload. And once that's done, then I'm going to go Z from Max back into ZBrush. And when I do that, it'll recognize that the two meshes are basically the same, except that the UVs have changed on the 3D Max version. It'll ask me if I want to transfer. Let me just make sure there's no mask on this. I'll clear the mask. Let me go to the lowest res. So if I go back to 3D Max, and if I go Z this, for the most part, it should actually ask me if I want to transfer the UVs. Now, for some reason, I didn't get that warning, so I'm going to just see if I can try to go down to, first I'll go to UV map. So what that actually does is it sort of sets the resolution size of my normal maps or my textures. I tend to go to 4096. You always want to start from a fairly high to very high texture size, because you can easily scale down. It's virtually impossible to get any quality by scaling up texture size. So that's always a good starting point. The next step would be to go to normal map, because I do want to generate a normal map. And you know, if I had no UVs, I would not see this create normal map option. It'd be grayed out, but I know I've got UVs because I can see this button is visible. So I'm going to click on create normal map. And any second now you'll see, based on those UVs, right, I've got I've got the sort of high-res sculpting detail is basically now generated out. You can generate as well something that's called a displacement map. So the displacement map allows you to basically sort of at render time, any mesh that has a displacement map, if you're using Mental Ray, V-Ray, most major render engines, if you have a material that has displacement maps loaded into them, what it will do is basically divide the model at render time, and using that displacement map, it'll actually recreate the correct kind of let's say surface detailing and proportions that you had on your high-res sculpt from ZBrush. You can also basically just use that as a bump map if you like, or kind of play around with it a bit in Photoshop to sort of turn it into a bump map, because displacements can also be very, very heavy on render time. The normal map is basically a cheat for that high-res detail. It does capture the subtleties in the sculpting, but it doesn't actually change the fact that the mesh itself is low-res. So before exporting, what I typically like to do is click on clone normal map, and if I go to displacement, I'll say clone displacement. So what that actually does is it sort of sends a little snapshot over to the texture palette and the alpha palette. I find this is just the safest way to make sure these things export if you go Z back to 3D Max. So you'll have to do this for each subtool, by the way. Repeat this process for each subtool. And when you're ready to export all your new low-res subtools, then you can go into visible. So this line here in ZBrush is all about Go Z. So if in my subtools I only enabled my sort of low-res mesh, right? If I had a low-res version of the mustache, the ring, let's say the teeth, and this sort of knocker plate, then if I only had the visible new low-res stuff set to visible, I would export visible only. All those subtools would get sent with all the textures. In this case, I'm only working on the main bulk of the head, so I'm just going to click on visible, and that's the only tool that's left. Let me just send that over. So what you'll see if you're exporting to max, I'll hit the material button. So I'm going to switch to my kind of compact or classic mode here. And I'm going to use a little eyedropper. If you're in, by the way, if you're in Slate, you can still use the eyedropper. What it will do is kind of grab the material and throw it into your, it should throw it into your workspace. Let me go back to compact here and eyedrop this. Yeah, for some reason the material didn't show up. So let me just reset my max and try to go Z one more time. Sometimes it's actually very useful to make sure you have a clean scene that you go Z back into if you're exporting your final stuff. So go back to visible. There, and I think I've got a good version now. So I'm going to hit M for material, and I'm going to eyedrop this, and you'll actually see that a basic flat white texture has been exported. I don't really want that in this case. If I had a texture, it'd be great, but in this case I don't. So I'm just going to clear that out. And if I actually change my display mode, so I'm going to have to click and hold this little option and set this to be realistic display. This is the best way to get normal maps to show up in your viewport. So you'll see now, let me maybe turn off the shadows in here. So I'll turn off ambient occlusion for sure. And if I go into, let's say, specularity, make this thing a little more specular, a little more glossy, right? Just so I can see a little bit more contrast on the surface, I'm going to change the surface color to dark gray. And then I'll go into maps, and we'll see this thing basically as a normal bump. And maybe I'll, again, crank this up just to exaggerate, and we can see, right, all that sculpting detail is now showing up on the low-res surface. And if I go into a bit further down, mental ray connection, there's displacement. And we see the displacement map has been carried over from ZBrush. Now I'm going to disable displacement for a second, and I'll do a quick render just so you guys can see what's happening. So hit render, and we see, right, the normals are showing up properly, somewhat properly, I should say. There is a little bit of a weird glitch. Mainly you see these edges in the normal map. So there's a quick fix for that. I just need to go into my normal bump, click on that, find out where the normal image is loaded, go to the image location, and it's going to pop up this window. And the only thing I'm going to do is override the gamma settings here, make sure it's set to gamma 1.0, and say open again. And if I re-render this, I should get a much more kind of correct result. I won't see any weird edges for the most part. I'm also pumping up, you can see the normal map is set really, really high. So let me go back to the bump value here and maybe set it to 150. There we go. And render that out. So I now get, you know, at least I have the normal maps at this point showing through, and I'm getting a pretty good result in terms of the the overall mesh here. So I've got this ultra low res prop. It's 1400 polys, but I've captured all this higher res sculpting detail like the fine wrinkles and that sort of thing. So yeah, let me show you displacement. So if I turn on displacement, Mental Ray, by the way, is the render engine. So I'm going to hit render. So what's going to happen is the calculation will take a lot longer, and at render time, this thing will actually get subdivided, and the surface will actually get deformed based on the sculpting information that's captured within the displacement. In this case, I probably don't want to use the displacement map. I could always just right-click and copy that map. And maybe just throw it into the bump. So I'll go into bump, and under additional bump, I can just sort of paste an instance of that displacement. So this is DM, right, for displacement. NM is for normal map. And then I'll have this kind of nice hybrid of the two maps. Yeah, displacement's off. Let me turn this down a little bit, and I'll just get a more subtle effect. I find it's kind of really blasting out, so I just want to sort of smooth this out a little bit. So that's basically that. You know, and this is very typical in any kind of game production, but even in a lot of TV productions, if you have a lot of detailed props that are repeated or elements in the environment, you need to save a bit on your budget, your render times. You can go about cheating in this way to really save a lot of time in your renders. So I hope that helps you guys. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions.